Hello and welcome to this Robocraft2 video. This video will be kind of different because we won't spend any time inside of Robocraft2, but rather in the Google Calculator, which is kind of the poor man's version of Microsoft Excel, right? So anyhow, after FreeM changed how Armour worked, making my old video about Armour very much obsolete, and this one will kind of be obsolete soon a tiny bit, because they want to change how plasma works. But anyway, like I think most of the points I will bring up here will kind of stay the same anyway. It's just like laser versus plasma might be a bit off in these calculations. Anyhow, this video might be extremely boring for some people and might be extremely interesting, I think, for other people, depending like how you approach games as a person. This video is also not for someone who don't know much about how Robocraft 2 works. It's rather for people who do know quite a lot already, that I think this will be really interesting for. But of course, if you want to stay anyway, regardless of how much you know or not. Anyhow, I did a bunch of tests. So what I did was stacking 9x9 connections. In hindsight, I probably should have done a little bit smaller connection sizes, because realistically, you're not going to use many 9x9 connections. You're going to use like 4. Oh, we're not going to go there yet. You're just going to go like for like 4 times 9, 5 times 9, something like that. And I did it in 2 different sizes, like, or thickness, like 1/3 and full cube thick. And the reason for that is that's what I wanted to test most of all, like how thickness affected Armour. I shot with both laser and plasma and calculated kind of the average damage per second, not exactly in damage per second, but how many plates I lost per second against different like weapons, right? So you can see here, for example, except for the first 2 shots. And the reason for that is how penetration system works. It's natural that the first shot will do less damage because that cube will be undamaged when the first shot hits, while some damage will pass through to the next cube that will like already be damaged when the second shot hits. So after like the first cubes are hit, that kind of evens out, right? So anyway, you can see here that this is Lodium, and you pretty much for every volley of laser you lose just 1 plate. But since the recharge time for laser is half a second, that means you're gonna lose 2 plates a second, right? And this is like a stack of, I had 40 plates stacked on top of each other when I tested this. Anyway, I did the same for a full cube, and here you see like the value for that, how many cubes you lost or how many plates you lost per second. And I did the same for plasma. This is a bit interesting, but I think what's a lot more interesting is this. And this like numbers here are kind of not exactly HP. I wrote relative HP, but I kind of just used this connection of Ladium, like the 1/3 thick Ladium plates as a baseline, and then I compared everything to that. So what these numbers say is like this is 25% as strong as Ladium, and this is 12.5% as strong. And we can easily see that down here. Like for every shot against the Ladium plate, where you lose like 1 Ladium plate, you would lose 4 plates of Moderanium, right? So it's 4 times as strong. So it kind of, yeah, this is it, right? It makes it easy to compare. You can see here for the one thick cubes, again, compared to the Ladium of less thickness, that 1 thick cube of Ladium is 2.5 times as strong as 1 cube or 1/3 thickness of Ladium, meaning you get kind of a good payoff for going thicker, at least from a standpoint of CPU efficiency. It becomes really good. Like you get almost 3 times the strength for just like you got 2.5 times the strength, of course, right? For 3 times the weight. So it's rather good. It scales rather good, right? Same here. For Moderanium, also scales rather good. You see almost 3 times as much as well, and same thing for Arium. I did something called weight. I called weight efficiency as well, and it's pretty much like how much of this, or how much like my number of relative HP, right, do you get per kilo? So again, this is nothing you can see like, okay, it takes X amount of damage. It's more like everything is still relative to these numbers, right? But it's a good way of comparing right? If you want to see like how much armor I get per kilo invested, and you want to compare between both in thickness and in between different types of materials, right? So here what's important is I use these numbers, and of course like a 9x9 plate weighs a lot more, but again it doesn't matter, right? As long as I stay consistent, because like I would just take both sides of the equation times 9, right? So it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that here I make this part that I compare 3 times as heavy as I use here when I go for weight efficiency, right? So anyhow, these numbers here tells us that it's quite a small difference between weight efficiency. Like you don't lose much, just like we can see easily here, right? You don't lose that much weight efficiency or how much armor you get per kilo by going thicker against laser. So that, I think that's really interesting. It kind of makes a strong point for scaling up some cubes. Again, looking at laser relative values that's not just comparing to that, but it's like for this it is, but then I just wanted to see like it's easier to see how many times you get 12.5 into 1, but it's not as easy because you can look at it as percentages, right? But it's not as easy to immediately spot how much is 0.33 of 2.5, right? So I just wanted to check like this is also like that. Is it the difference how Palladium compared to Arium, if we're talking 1 thick compared to a 3rd thick? That's like what I use these numbers for. I guess plasma gets really interesting, and this is the part that might change now, because in the next upcoming patch they will buff the damage of plasma, so we'll see if this stays the same. But what these higher numbers tells us is that Palladium, same size, same thickness, is 3 times as strong against plasma compared to against laser, if we're talking like a thin plate, right? So anyway, that means plasma is weaker. Same for moduranium, weaker, and Arium, weaker, right? Like the second really interesting thing apart from that, and these numbers will change with the next patch, but I think the rest will actually stay true, and that's like the scaling effect from going thicker against plasma is different from the scaling effect against laser. If we look here at Palladium, here you got almost 3 times as much. Here you only get like 25% more for scaling up to 3 times the weight. So Palladium scales really poorly going thicker against plasma. Moduranium just scales so, not nearly as good as it does against laser. The only thing that really scales well going thicker against plasma is Arium. And I think that has to do with the energy levels. And since they're just buffing damage and not energy levels, I think this will still hold true. So what you can see here is that a 1 thick cube of Arium, despite being almost a third in weight compared to moduranium, is almost as strong. So this good scaling against both laser and plasma makes for a really strong argument of using thicker Arium in your build. So that's the first really interesting thing. I got some keynotes here. Feel free to pause and read them if you want. I think I touched on most of them here. So let's jump over to restrictions. So like I said, Arium scales really well, but against laser, the other material scales quite good as well. The next thing I wanted to test was like, you can either be, in my opinion, right? You will have some restrictions when you build, right? And those restrictions in Robocraft 2 is either CPU or weight. You will either get too heavy, so you can't really put as much armor on, or you will run out of CPU. And one thing will happen before the other. So what I wanted to know was, are my builds mostly weight restricted or CPU restricted? Because our choices for scaling up to thicker plates depend on the restriction we have. Because if you don't have any CPU restriction and you're only restricted by weight, even though you don't really gain that much of having like 3 plates of like thin plates stacked on top of each other, you still gain a little over having one thick cube. Meaning if you're not restricted by CPU, only by weight, despite actually like it's being in theory a good trade, you will still want to have just thin stacked plates. So anyway, what I did, I did a test where I just wrote the like numbers for like a normal APC. How many you want to be, like 6 wheels for this one, a pilot seat, you want aiming service, in this case laser. I just sum up the total weight, total CPU. Then I used a dev blog where FU did a classification of medium, light, and heavy. Heavy is supposedly tank tracks, not released yet. Medium is the starter APC, so if you want to know like how would a robot weighting that much behave, then you can look at the starter APC, and light is a flyer, right? I put a little tribute here, or not tribute, but like a reference to charge and target, which helped me like with how much a Unity unit, because they only showed Unity unit is in Robocraft kilos, right? So here you can write preferred weight, which is how heavy your craft should be. Area of armor is pretty much if you do like a mock-up of the build you want to make. You can see like how much area do I need to cover with armor. That is important. And max CPU, of course. I haven't put the CPU for the guns here because there's no point, because you want to use that CPU for guns anyway and not armor. So anyway, what I calculate down here is pretty much in order to cover this much area, given my preferred weight, how many layers of different materials can I afford? So this is just a number I use for calculate. It's this pretty much, it just shows me like, it helps me calculate how many layers I can afford. So anyway, for Arium, given this preferred weight, I could afford 22 layers of Arium. I could afford 8 layers of Moderanium and just a bit more than 2 layers of Ladium. Now the thing is, in reality, you will be able to afford less because you want to use Ladium for the connections where you like your wheels, your guns and stuff, because of Mom's Spaghetti. And if you don't get that reference, you can Google Mom's Spaghetti and Eminem, and then you will get what I'm talking about. Plus, you get to listen to a great song. So that's kind of a win-win, right? Anyhow, so 22 connections of Arium, or layers of Arium, is of course stronger than 8 layers of Moderanium. So because if we go back here, right, you see here, you take twice this amount, you get up to Moderanium. So we should take this one like twice this amount. So that means Moderanium is twice as strong. So 2 times 8 is 16. This is a higher number, which means we get more armor for the same amount of weight using Arium, right? Even worse if we use Ladium. So what this tells us is, because we're weight restricted here, we should use Arium. Because if we kind of go down towards Ladium and we start stacking more layers on, we're just going to get too heavy. We're not going to have our target weight. We're going to be too clumsy, too slow. Second thing we need to do, and like that's when you're weight restricted. And how do we know we're weight restricted and not CPU restricted? By looking at connection average area. If this number is somewhere like 9 by 9 is 81, right? So if this number would be higher than 81, means we wouldn't be able to cover the area. Actually, if it's like something like 70, 60 is kind of like the, I would say like along the lines of, or close to where you would say you kind of is a bit CPU restricted. But as I mentioned, the real number here will be a bit lower because you want to use Ladium for some core functions in your robot anyway. And that will add some weight. But like this means that our average connection will be something like 9 times 6, right? And I think like the average connection in a real robot will be a bit lower than that. But if you need to make some connection that is like 10 by 10 to make enough armor area, then that means it's not possible because you don't have enough CPU. So in order to actually, but if you look down here, but like the connection average area is only 23, which means very, very small. So here you're definitely weight restricted and not CPU restricted. If we look at tanks, like we said 40k here, that's quite a lot. Now we can see that we can do 140 layers of really thin plates, But in order to afford that with CPU, they need to be like almost 400 in area, and that's of course not possible, which means in this case we're really CPU restricted and not weight restricted, which means there's a really strong argument here for going thicker plates, especially thicker Arium plates. You have a lot of weight to spare, and you're out of CPU, right? But it's only for builds that actually don't exist yet. Most builds will be in this area, right? So even though there is this really strong argument for going thicker plates, and especially for Arium, no one's really going to do that. So that brings me kind of to my conclusion. I made this little thing here, and we can see stuff scales. First of all, that like Moderanium is just a worse kind of Arium, right? It's not really excelling at anything, and it's very close in its behavior towards Arium. It's just like Arium, but not as Arium as Arium. It doesn't really have any great properties, like just meh, kind of. I would kind of like it to be just more average at everything instead of being like average towards poor at stuff. The second thing is, of course, like I mentioned, Ladium, not as great, but at least it got going for it that you need it for the stuff that where you only have one shot, right? So your guns, pallet chair, etc. And the second thing is that it is the most CPU effective. So like tanks that don't really have to care about weight will have great use of it. It will be really strong on tanks, right? The second thing that is interesting is, of course, that Ladium is comparatively, we're talking comparatively now, not strict in numbers, but comparatively worse versus Plasma and better versus Laser compared to Arium and Moderanium. And the reason for like why Arium scales so well is I think Plasma has like 1000 energy while Laser has 2000. So probably a thin plate of Ladium is enough to stop all the energy from Plasma. So like it doesn't really provide extra benefit going thicker. There is no real reason to go to go 1/3 Moderanium, except maybe size. Like one Arium is very close to the same weight as 1/3 Moderanium, and is way better. We can look here at restrictions, right? Oh, not light test, right? So what I mean by this, if we look at Moderanium, this is a thin plate of Moderanium, and then we look at the one thick plate of Arium. This one is, if we look at CPU efficiency, a bit better than the Moderanium plate. If we look at weight, and we can also look at Plasma, right? Way better versus Plasma than the thin plates of Moderanium. If we look at weight, it's just really shy of like 3 times, almost close to 3 times as light, meaning a full-size cube of Arium weighs pretty much the same as a third thick plate a thin plate of Arium weighs pretty much the same. I'm messing this up. So anyway, I like to get back on track. Like a full cube thick of Arium weighs pretty much the same as a thin plate of Moderanium. There, I got it. So it's pretty much better in any way, right? And this brings me back to like the meh about Moderanium, right? And like my feedback that I think is kind of relevant for the developers is that because pretty much every single build is weight locked, they built this great system that hardly no one except like one type of movement type will use, right? So I kind of wish they would rethink and put like the weight and damage and penetration systems where kind of you get to scale this benefit of having thicker plates at an earlier state. What I mean by that is that you will be CPU, like not weight restricted, but rather CPU restricted at a lower weight than you are right now, because that would make people use this I think to a greater extent, and it will at least be useful to a greater extent for more different type of builds, because I think it's a really neat system. But if no one can effectively use it because it's not good for your weight class, then it doesn't matter how great it is, right? So I think this is one thing. The other thing is the poor state Moderanium is in. Like they really should think about on FreeGem like how to get your own spot against Moderanium, right? Maybe make it. I would kind of want to see, for example, like you have this where the Ladium is comparatively stronger, right, against laser and comparatively worse against plasma. I would like that to be even more clear, right? That Ladium would be even more comparatively better against laser and even more worse against plasma, and vice versa for Arium, and then Moderanium could take the position of being somewhat good against both, right? A middle ground. So if you want to do so against every weapon type, you can go Moderanium. If you want to be really strong against a certain weapon type, you can go laser, and against the other weapon type, plasma, right? That would be interesting. But I think like it needs a spot where it shines, because it really doesn't right now. I hope you found this like analysis of the current situation of Armour in Robocraft 2 interesting. I know it's not like your typical kind of Robocraft 2 video, but I hope at least some people enjoy it. Let me know in the comment what you think about this. Do you agree with this? Yeah, cheers.